It is now 12:30 and we will begin today's session. I will now turn it over to our training specialist, Caleb Bergmeyer.
Welcome everyone to this webinar about effective communication with people who have hearing, vision, and speech disabilities, brought to you by the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, a project of TransCen, Inc. My name is Caleb Bergmeyer. I'm the training specialist for the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, and I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. Nancy Horton is the Technical Assistance and Project Specialist for the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, where she provides information and guidance to individuals with disabilities, employers, businesses, public agencies, designers, and others. She has worked in the disability field for more than 30 years, and her experience includes writing articles and fact sheets on ADA topics, developing ADA training materials, and conducting trainings on accessible design, employment issues, and effective communication requirements. So I will now turn the microphone over to Nancy.
Thank you, Caleb, and thanks to all of you who have joined us this afternoon for our brief overview of ADA requirements for facilities, vehicles, and services related to communicating with people who have hearing, vision, and speech disabilities. We are going to jump right in on slide 11. Our focus today is on Title II of the ADA, which covers state and local government agencies, and Title III as it relates to places of public accommodation, which are various types of private businesses that offer goods and services to the general public. On slide 12, the regulatory agencies for these titles of the ADA are the U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT. They regulate and set standards for transportation facilities, vehicles, and services covered under these titles. And the U.S. Department of Justice regulates and sets standards for all other types of facilities, programs, and services that are covered under these titles. Now on slide 13, we're going to provide some highlights of communication access features within facilities. On slide 14, there's a list here of some examples of elements that have communication features that are addressed in the ADA standards. Now, many of these elements are simply required to have redundant notification mechanisms, such as the fire alarm signal pictured here, which includes both sound and light features so that people with vision or hearing disabilities have a way to receive the alarm signal. Other elements might require other types of features, such as tactile features on signs or controls, like ATM keys or elevator buttons, that people who are blind can feel, or characters that are designed to be easy to read for people who have low vision. Now, we're not going to go into much detail or really talk about all of these elements, but we do want to touch on a few. On our next slide, number 15, telephones. Where public telephones are provided, and we don't see them as much as we used to, but we do still see public telephones in certain types of facilities. And where they're provided, they need to include volume control, which is represented by the symbol that you see here of the handset with radiating sound waves, and that's representing volume control telephones. And also, in certain locations where public telephones are provided, TTYs need to be provided, like this one pictured here. A TTY is a small keyboard device that is connected to a telephone and facilitates a text-based conversation. TTYs aren't used as much as they used to be. So many people these days, of course, have smartphones with built-in capabilities that facilitate text-based or even video-based communication options. But TTYs still are required in certain locations. Additionally, emergency response services such as police, fire, and ambulance services, which at most communities these days is handled through 911 centers, must be able to directly answer calls from individuals using TTYs. This is another area where we're seeing a lot of technological development and expanding capabilities. It's likely that TTY technology as we know it will ultimately be phased out as we move further away from traditional wired and circuit-based systems to wireless and internet-based systems. On our next slide, assistive listening systems are required in assembly areas where audible communication is integral to the use of the space. That's some language from the ADA standards. And where there is an audio amplification system. Assistive listening systems are required in courtrooms even if there is no amplification system provided. Now, assembly areas include facilities like lecture halls, arenas, all kinds of theaters. And assistive listening systems are different from basic PA or audio amplification systems in that assistive listening systems take a signal from a sound source, they amplify it, but they deliver it directly to individuals using individual receivers or in some cases personal hearing aids. Assistive listening systems can be used alone or in conjunction with an audio amplification system for their sound source. On slide 17, we want to talk about some provisions in the ADA standards that are designed to address safe navigation for people who are blind or have low vision. In circulation spaces, between the heights of 27 inches and 80 inches above the floor or ground, objects must not protrude more than 4 inches horizontally into circulation paths. So what does that look like? What are we talking about there? On our next slide, slide 18, we see this illustration of a gentleman. He's navigating down a hallway using a long cane. And we see in the foreground of this image a couple of drinking fountains. They're cantilevered off the wall. They're protruding quite a way off the wall here. The lower fountain is probably designed to be wheelchair accessible. And both fountains have clear space underneath them. But they've been recessed back into a little alcove in the wall that's been created by jogging the wall back a bit there so that the fountains themselves aren't protruding more than 4 inches into the actual circulation pathway there. Now behind those fountains, we see a couple of objects mounted on the wall. Looks like a fire extinguisher cabinet, a light fixture. But those objects aren't sticking out from the wall more than 4 inches, so they're not going to create a problem for this gentleman who can't see them. In the background, you see a sign that protrudes quite a bit, quite a ways from the wall that's indicating some room numbers back there. And it clearly is protruding a great distance from the wall, but it's located above that 80-inch height. So again, it's not creating any kind of a potential hazard for individuals who can't see that sign. Now on our next slide, number 19, Again, that 80-inch high vertical clearance needs to be maintained throughout circulation pathways. And I always like to point out this particular image on this slide, which shows a gentleman navigating on a sidewalk outside of a business using a long cane. And there's a maintenance worker there who's trimming some tree branches that have grown out and they're protruding down below that 80-inch height into that circulation area. And so the worker is trimming those so they won't be hazardous to folks who may not be able to see them. There's a requirement, specific requirement in both Title II and Title III that any types of features or elements or spaces that are required to be accessible, accessibility is required to be maintained. Now on our next slide, we want to talk a little bit about detectable warning surfaces. These are these bumpy surfaces. They have these domes, truncated domes across the section of surface like you see here in this image. And they're designed to be perceived by individuals who are blind or have low vision, either using a cane or even when you step on these, you can feel that it's a different sort of texture there, and designed to alert people. These surfaces are required under the current ADA standards at specific locations, rail station boarding platforms, where trains pull up like the one pictured here. You can see that surface along the edge of that platform, and on curb ramps, but only at transportation facility sites. DOT requires these in their standards, where DOJ does not require them at other types of facilities. Now, it's important for us to understand on our next slide, number 21, the distinction between detectable warning surfaces and detectable warning objects. Detectable warning surfaces are placed at a boundary of two different types of areas, as in the image that we see here, where we see a section of detectable warning surface at the bottom of a curb ramp where the sidewalk meets the street. This is designed to alert an individual that they're approaching a potentially dangerous area. But it's not designed to stop someone from proceeding. It's designed to simply alert them. Where a detectable warning object is generally some sort of a structural element, like a fence, a wall, planters, something that's designed to literally stop someone from proceeding in a certain direction and actually prevent them from encountering a hazard, such as it's illustrated here in this image of this open staircase. They've figured out at what point does the underside of this open staircase drop down to that point of 80 inches above the ground, and so they've built out a little fence underneath there that extends to that point that's going to keep anyone like this lady here navigating with her cane who can't maybe see the stairs, and it's going to prevent her from actually walking into those stairs. Now, on our next slide, number 22, signs. Obviously, signs are an important communication tool that we see traditionally used in facilities and on sites to help people find their way around. Signs that designate permanent rooms and spaces, like the sign here that's designating floor number 4. These types of signs need to include raised and braille characters, and these signs need to be mounted in specific locations relative to the doors or doorways to the spaces that they designate and identify, so that people who are going to read the signs by touching them can find them in these fairly consistent locations. Now, signs that provide information about or direction to spaces need to have other types of features that make them easy to read for people who have low vision. Features like good contrast between characters and background. Features like simple types of characters that make signs legible. But these types of signs, because they're placed in very inconsistent locations and need to be, so that they need to be placed at decision points and various locations, they don't have to include tactile features because people who need to find signs by feel would not have any real effective way to find a lot of these informational and directional signs. Now on slide 23 we do have some specific requirements related to transportation, including I call this slide waiting at the train station. Public address systems in stations need to be complemented with that information presented in a visible format. Now we want to jump and talk a little bit about some of the features that are required in vehicles that are covered under these parts of the ADA. On slide 25, some of the current vehicle standards that we see require similar features across various types: buses, vans, automated guideway, transit or AGT systems, sometimes called people movers. These are driverless types of systems, trams, and all kinds of rail cars: light rail, rapid, high-speed, commuter, and intercity rail, Amtrak. There are various features. And on our next slide, 26, we see certain features that are fairly common across different types of vehicles. We don't see complete consistency, but we do see some commonality. We tend to see requirements for both audible and visible signals for doors closing, requirements for a band of contrasting color at steps or thresholds to vehicles, signs to be legible, legibility features for the type of signs that might designate priority seating or identify routes or destinations. And we see requirements for public address systems for driver or automated announcements. Note that under the current standards in most types of vehicles, there's no requirement for information conveyed through these announcements to be displayed in a visible format. However, on our next slide, number 27, the U.S. Access Board is engaged in a rulemaking process to update vehicle standards. We do have final guidelines from the board for buses and vans, which represent a significant update to guidelines for public address systems. On slide 28, under these guidelines, which are not enforced yet, but they call for, within large vehicles operated by large transit agencies in fixed route, multi-stop systems, to have both audible and visible identification of routes and notification of stops. And the audible component of that would be required to be an automated announcement, something like synthesized speech, a recording, or digitized speech instead of a driver announcement, and accompanied by a visible format that's legible. Now, we want to jump ahead and talk a little bit about the sort of requirements that are related to communicating within programs and services and activities, and sometimes the more personal interactions. On slide 30, both Title II and Title III require covered entities to provide auxiliary aids and services, including often on an individualized basis, to ensure effective communication with people who have disabilities affecting vision, hearing, or speech. On slide 31, we just see some common examples of auxiliary aids and services. Some common examples that might be needed by people who are deaf or hard of hearing include the exchange of written notes or the provision of printed materials using assistive listening systems or assistive listening devices, qualified interpreters, captioned media, or real-time captioning, like we're using here today in this session. Some common examples that might be needed by people who are blind or have low vision, including materials in formats like large print, Braille, or electronic, using qualified readers, audio recordings, audio described media, or simply describing visual elements. On slide 32, whether methods or devices that are used are simple or sophisticated, the goal is to make communication equally effective. Covered entities choose auxiliary aids or services according to individuals' needs in the context of specific situations, considering the nature, the length, and the complexity and other factors of the actual activity or interaction at hand. Now, we have some specific requirements in the transportation realm. Stop announcements are required to be made at transfer points, major intersections, and destination points, at intervals, reasonable intervals that enable individuals, particularly individuals who have vision disabilities, to remain oriented to where they are. Additionally, stop announcements need to be made by individual request. So if an individual gets on the bus and asks the driver to let him know when they get to a certain stop or station, the driver needs to do that. Also, information, like maybe bus schedules or train schedules, may need to be provided in accessible formats. On slide 34, we just want to kind of wrap things up a little bit by offering some tips for designers and operators. To begin with, acoustics and lighting, as well as thinking about places for interpreters to work, we tend to find that these issues get a lot of consideration in the design and operation of things like theaters and certain assembly areas, but maybe not as much in other types of facilities. But these kinds of factors can really be important. They can really affect communication. They can enhance or detract from effective communication. Structural factors like the size or the configuration of spaces, the types of building materials and surfaces used, colors and patterns and types of finishes like fabrics, carpeting, and lighting can really have an effect on communication. I'm sure most of us have been in spaces that seem to really magnify sound or create a lot of echo, or spaces where lighting seems to create a lot of glare or blind spots, or where wall or floor surfaces create backgrounds that make it difficult to see things or focus on things. So I really encourage designers and operators to really think about these issues in all types of spaces. Another issue, make sure that equipment like assistive listening systems is of a good quality and it's the right type of system for the venue, for the situation. There are different types of assistive listening systems and devices, and they don't all work well in all settings. Related to that, again, the maintenance issue. Make sure that your equipment, that your facilities are well maintained, and test things, review things, check on things, like your assistive listening equipment. Make sure that it's in good working order, that it's charged, and all these kinds of things. Also, service animal relief areas. Think about that. Where are folks going to take their service animals when they are at your site or your facility? On slide 35, a few more tips for transportation system operators. that are still using driver announcements, monitor those announcements. Monitor them for clarity, for volume in different situations, different times of day, and to make sure that drivers are actually making them where they're supposed to. When it comes to signage, recognize the limitations of minimum standards for accessible signage. I really encourage folks to approach wayfinding in a broad way and to view wayfinding as an integral component of both design and operations. And my final point, this is probably one of the best tips that I can offer, is to train staff. Train staff depending on what their job is, what their function is, to make sure that they understand facility issues, equipment that's available, how to use things. All of those kinds of issues are absolutely critical, a critical component to compliance. There's a specific requirement in DOT's rule for transportation operators to train staff. And even though it's not specifically required in other parts of the ADA, we tend to find that if it doesn't happen, then compliance can sometimes be compromised and things can be more difficult for both covered entities and the public. So with that, we're going to wrap up our very bird's eye view of some highlights of these issues. We are the ADA Center in the Mid-Atlantic region. You can find us online at adainfo.org. We are one of 10 regional centers, ADA centers around the country that provide information, guidance, and training on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you can reach us or your regional ADA center by calling toll-free 800-949-4232. And with that, I'm going to turn things back to Caleb.
Thank you, Nancy, for that presentation. It's always good to be reminded just how expansive the concept of communication really is. Session evaluations will be sent out soon, so we value your feedback, so please fill out the evaluations and let us know what you thought of today's session. On slide 37, you'll see some information about our 25th annual ADA conference, September 4th through 6th. And registration is now open, and you can register and find more information at adaupdate.org. Along with general sessions on the ADA, this year we have session tracks for businesses, healthcare professionals, law enforcement and corrections, and state and local governments. So if you happen to be in one of these areas, you especially would want to go on and register for this conference. It'll be very valuable for you. So you can find all the information at adaupdate.org. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.